interested in hearing about this because I was part of the DC Tenant Union, I guess, meeting that they brought down the folks from New York.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
I remember you from that.
yeah. So I'm excited that you're here talking to ANC. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's great. I knew your name, and I knew it was from like the tenant movement, but wasn't sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay, cool. Well, I think Eliana, I think we have everybody who registered, at least from the last time I checked. So I think we could go ahead and get started.
All right. So, hey, everyone. My name is Eliana, and I'm an organizer with DC Job with Justice and also with the Reclaim Control campaign. So today we're going to be speaking about a little bit about what rent control is and how we plan to strengthen and expand rent control and how you as ANCs can take a role in this. So first, I'm going to start with the emergency legislations that has been passed due to all the great organizing by our tenants and our tenants and our residents. So due to their constant fight, we right now we have no eviction filings during the emergency and 30 days after. We landlords can't charge late fees. They also cannot increase rent during the emergency and 30 days after. There's no utility cutoffs during the emergency. For example, it's prohibited to cut off gas, water, electricity, or internet, or cable during the emergency. Lastly, there has to be landlords have to provide a payment plan for residents who require it due to hardships because of coronavirus, and this includes owners who have 5 units or more.
I was just going to say, we just wanted to include that because, obviously as like community leaders, people may come to you with some of these issues. This is all like new and emergency legislation. So just so that you're aware that this legislation does exist, right? And then you can always call Office of the Tenant Advocate or call one of the groups that Janice mentioned, Latino Economic Development Center, Housing Counseling Services at the Tenant Union. And yeah, there was just a request I saw in chat about sharing this with all ANCs. What we're going to do is we'll be posting this training to our website, and we'll also be sharing web resources. So definitely, and we'll just ask for Renee's continued support getting the word out with those resources. So do you want me to do the next?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we know that there's a huge affordable housing crisis right now. With COVID-19, there's an anticipated, right now they're calling it the eviction cliff, a wave of evictions, as just so many tenants are unable to pay for rent. Luckily, DC does have this emergency legislation requiring payment plans. But for us, it's really the fact that so many residents were unable to pay their rent the first month that they lost work really shows how unaffordable housing is in DC, right? The fact that people just are not able to save. So we know that the affordable housing crisis didn't start with COVID-19. It's not going to end with just emergency legislation. There's a need for real long-term solutions.
So what is rent control? Rent control is a set of laws designed to help keep affordable housing and protect tenants from excessive rent increases and displacement. The way rent control works now is there's only one rent increase allowed per year. It limits the rent increase to the inflation of that year plus the 2%. And for seniors and people with disabilities, if they're registered, it limits the increase of rent to the inflation of the year. Approximately 90 million families are in the district are protected by rent control.
90,000.
90,000, sorry.
So what buildings are covered in rent control? Most of the time, it's actually going to be pretty easy as you walk around your neighborhood to guess which buildings are covered. They're the older buildings, so buildings built before 1976, larger buildings, anything bigger than 4 units, and buildings that don't have a subsidy. So for example, Section 8 buildings, public housing, low-income housing tax credits, all of those have other affordability rules and have subsidies attached. So, I mean, honestly, when I am kind of looking at what's a rent control building, they tend to be the older ones. A lot of times they aren't in as good condition because they haven't had an income stream to keep them up. But that really varies neighborhood by neighborhood. And this is, we've been working with the Urban Institute to collect data on rent controlled housing. This is still we're refining it because we know kind of the possible universe of rent controlled buildings, and now we're trying to take out the ones that have been lost to the program or have had some sort of petition. But this is a pretty good approximation. And the city currently does not have this list. So it's something that we're developing, and you may be aware that there's been city funding for a rent control database for quite a while now, but it just hasn't happened. So we'll share with you a link where you can look at this a little bit closer. But essentially you can look at this and see your ANC and about how many units are in your ANC. So the really light purple is 1,000 or less. The really dark ones have 4,000 or more. And that's essentially families, right, living in rent control housing. I think this data, I saw a question about it. I think the data is from, there's actually a 2015 Urban Institute study, and they are working on some updates now. And they're definitely, the biggest thing they're working on right now is updating that data. We had this whole plan, just as an aside, about doing real like citizen research and actually going to the buildings and making sure that they were still rent control and some other things that also just the data is housed on physical computers at the Department of Housing and Community Development, not in a database. So with COVID, like that's delaying these plans, but we're still working on them. So is it sorted by demographic? Well, yeah, so what we can do, what we have been talking about is doing kind of overlays with the maps. You know, there's not like that kind of data isn't really being collected. It's not being collected for rent controlled housing. You know, you can sort of look at, I think it's, yeah, I think you would be able to kind of tell knowing your neighborhood, right? Is this a building built before 76, 4 or more units, and whether it includes students or not? I mean, that would still be rent controlled housing if they were living in that. Yeah, I haven't seen the buildings that I've worked at, but I primarily worked in wards 1, 2, and 4, 7 and 8 some. I wasn't seeing student populations really in rent control housing, but it could happen. All right, go ahead, Eliana.
Why is rent control? Affordable rent provides stability for everyone, which leads to a healthier lives, better education, and an overall stronger community. It prevents displacements. It ensures that residents who have worked and built their communities can stay living in the communities for generations. It provides affordable housing. It increased the overall affordable housing in the market. However, rent control isn't working as well as it should be. So 20,000 Black residents were pushed out of the city between the years 2000 and 2013. And since rent control was made, we have lost 38% of our rent controlled units, which is extreme.
So why are we working to what we call reclaim rent control, right? To strengthen and expand rent control. We know that this is a racial justice issue. DC is becoming increasingly segregated. Most of these stats are from a report by DC Fiscal Policy Institute, showing that about half of DC's Black population lives east of the Anacostia, and that percentage is growing. We know that with every rent increase, a lot of DC residents may be forced to move further away from their community, their families, their schools, hospitals, and that low-income people, which is particularly people of color, seniors, people with disabilities, and immigrants are the most affected when rents skyrocket. And I think there was a question, I think for the previous slide about increasing supply of affordable housing. So I think part of that is that the rent control preserves affordable rents, so that it allows them to stay. There's a few, there's lots of different ways that we define affordability, whether that's like under a certain amount of money or affordable to people, but rent control keeps those part of the supply. It also allows for units that are, for example, eligible for voucher holders. We know that if the rent is too high, somebody with a voucher wouldn't be able to use it.
So our demands, we want to keep rents affordable for current and future resident. We want to limit rent increases and vacancy increases. So we have an example here of a tenant named Ella Burdocks. Her and her daughter and grandson were forced to move out of a Northwest building that named the Van Burden because the management decided to raise the rent, the full amount allowed under rent control, which is the inflation plus the 2%. Even though Ella had 2 jobs, she still didn't make enough to pay. It was $1,200 for a 1-bedroom apartment. So eventually they were forced to move out. And what makes the situation even worse is when they moved out, landlords are allowed to raise the rent an additional 20% because of the vacancy increase. So the new tenants that move in will have to pay $2,520 for just a 1-bedroom apartment, which is really, it's crazy.
So this chart just shows how rents under rent control rise faster than wages. So what we did was we just kind of assumed that somebody was moving in, paying $1,000 a month. And they were moving in, we said, with an income of $40,000 a year, so that they were paying 30% of their income towards rent initially. So that's considered affordable and not rent burdened if you're paying around 30% of income towards rent. And we gave them a raise every year, looking at, kind of how wages increase in the DC area. But under rent control, even if this person is getting annual raises, within 20 years, they'll be paying 40% of their income towards rent. Under our platform, which we'll be explaining, which eliminates that extra 2%, it keeps the rent in line with income increases. And as you can see, actually, in 20 years, you'll be paying a slightly lower percentage, so about 28% of income towards rent. And let's see.
This is Commissioner Farabee. Can I just say something?
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things to consider, and you might get to it, is what happened in my building. Landlords can also raise the rent up to 125% if they do any kind of change in the doorknob. And I'm just being simplistic, because that's what happened, where the rent doubled, more than doubled in an apartment because somebody moved out and they put in a new floor. So that's also part of what we're, because that's how they're trying to get most of these apartments to become quote unquote market rent now.
Yeah, we'll look at that in a second. So you're probably talking about either a vacancy agreement or substantial rehab petition or
Substantial,
something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
I think we'll kind of come back to some of these questions because I feel like it's a little tricky to, but we'll keep an eye on the chat questions because I think there's good questions coming up in here, and it's great that you all are writing them as you're thinking about them. So I think we'll just kind of, we'll come back to those so we can actually pay attention to them. And this is just another chart essentially showing the same thing that, sometimes when we think about, okay, it's CPI, it's the rate of inflation plus this 2%. And, maybe on a yearly level, that doesn't look so dramatic, but over time, it makes a big difference. So if the rent starts at $1,000, in 20 years, it's going to nearly double just with that CPI plus 2%. Under reclaimed rent control, in 20 years, the rent will be $1,325. So it's keeping the rent affordable over the long term.
So I'm going to give you an example of how vacancy agreement works. So vacancy agreements allow rents to skyrocket. And I'm going to show you that example. So I want you guys to keep in mind that this is the same unit over the course of 5 years. So it's just the same unit, and you'll see how the rent increases. So apartment 2B, Pablo has lived in this apartment for 10 years, and his rent was $1,200. After 10 years, he decides to move, and here comes Maria. Because of the 20% vacancy agreement allowed under rent control, the rent will be raised to $1,440. She stays in this apartment for 3 years, and then here comes Joanna to take over the same apartment. When Joanna comes in, the apartment is now $1,700, and she stays there for 2 years. And then finally, here comes Pablo. Pablo, when he comes, the rent is $1,936. So as you can see, in 5 years, the rent went from $1,200 to $1,936, which is a huge increase. And now I'm going to give you an example of how that will work under our platform, eliminating that 2%. And this is the same apartment over the same course of 5 years. So again, Paul lives here in the same apartment for 12 years. When he moves in, his rent was $1,200.
Moved up.
And then Maria comes in. When she moves in, her rent is $1,219. She stays in the same apartment for 3 years. And after she leaves, Joanna comes and takes that apartment over. Her rent will be $1,277. She stays in this apartment for 2 years. And finally, here comes Pablo to take over the apartment. The apartment will be $1,318. So in the course of 5 years under our platform, the rent will go from $1,200 to $1,318, which is a huge difference. It aligns more with the rent increases over time. With the wage increases over time.
Mm-hmm. And something to think about is just how this affects in neighborhoods that have a lot of turnover. That's why you're seeing really high rent increases and really, significant differences between people who have lived there a long time and people who have not. I think I had one other point of just the other thing that we know that vacancy increases do is incentivize displacing long-term residents. So this particularly affects like seniors and other people who have lived there for a long time. If they can get that person out, they get this automatic 20% increase. So our next demand is about expanding rent control to protect more tenants. So what we want to do is include buildings, those 4-unit buildings that some of your neighborhoods may have. Can you switch, Eliana? The next slide. The 4-unit buildings, that will automatically add 8,000. It says 8,000 buildings. I think what we mean is 8,000 units actually. And including buildings that are 15 years and older. So this would add 17,000 families immediately, and then each year we would add a few buildings. Right, so any building built 1976 and later is not included in rent control per the law. The law was first created, and there's some different iterations of the law, but kind of this law was created in 75. So they didn't include older buildings. So we want to have this moving target, and having talked to developers and housing providers, we've had some consensus around 15 years.
So our demands, we want to protect tenants from extraordinary rent increases. So in order to do that, we want to take a look and reform all the housing provider petitions. So landlords use petitions to raise the rent well above normal rent control limits. We want to reform these petitions to better balance the needs of the landlords and the tenants. We want to make these petitions temporary instead of permanent. And we also think, we also require that landlords should have a capital reserve and should comply with the housing code before being able to raise rents via petitions.
So hardship petitions are when an owner is allowed to file these if they're not making a 12% return on the building's equity. So I just want to know it's on equity and not on profit. So the way hardship petitions are currently written, they really favor actually owners who who are bigger owners and who have actually had the building for a long time and maybe don't even have a mortgage, and that's why they have a lot of equity. And it really disfavors owners who do have a mortgage, who may have actually even a lower profit margin. So what we want to do is actually change hardship petitions to have the formula be based on profit, not based on equity. What we've seen in hardship petitions is the average rent increase when a hardship petition is passed is $642 a month. That's a 70% increase on average. So what really happens is that tenants leave. They either move because of the threat of a hardship petition or they move when it's granted. So our platform limits the guaranteed profit rate. So again, it's a profit rate, not equity. Narrows the scope of hardship petitions. So that's what Eliana was mentioning as far as it's only issues that have, it can only be passed if the housing code is already, the building's already meeting the housing code. Limits rent increases to 5% a year. So there would be increases that are phased in and makes the increases temporary.
So vacancy agreements. So typically in order,
Voluntary.
oh,
Voluntary.
sorry, voluntary agreements. Typically in order makes an agreement with the residents to keep their rent affordable in exchange for repairs, but they'll raise the rent for future tenants. And usually these increases are $800 more.
That's a month, right? $800 increase a month.
Yeah, a month. So
on average.
On average. So what landlords do after they get these voluntary agreements is sometimes they'll push out the tenants through bad conditions, or they'll pay them out so they will be able to raise the unit to market prices, or they'll do weird stuff like they won't even let the people know what they're signing. They'll give them the petition in English when they know they don't understand that language, so the tenants are not fully aware of what they're signing, and they're sometimes bought out or just displaced altogether.
And this graph is just showing where voluntary agreements happen. As you'll see, the most that have happened are in wards 1, 3, and 4. What we were kind of seeing, so I worked doing tenant organizing for 10 years, and what I think we really saw is neighborhoods that were gentrifying, neighborhoods where the owner thought they may be able to get a higher rent, is where they started putting these voluntary agreements into place. So Legal Aid did this research. The city actually has not compiled this, but we were able to get all of the voluntary agreements that were approved, found that over these years between 2007 and 2019, voluntary agreements were approved for over 5,000 units with an average increase of $800 a month. For the agreements, which is most of them where only future tenants have to pay, the average increase is about $1,200 a month. And so as a result, we lost a lot of affordable units. And so technically these units are still under rent control, but what happens is there's a very high limit put. So maybe I live in a unit that's $1,200 a month. I sign the voluntary agreement. The new limit will be, let's say, $5,000 a month or $3,000 a month. So if I move, they can raise the rent really however high up to that maximum. Maybe my unit doesn't actually yet fetch $3,000 on the market, so they would raise it to say $2,500, which means that that next tenant doesn't have any security, because if the limit is still higher than that, they could just give them a really big increase the next year. So in practice, it kind of takes these units out of rent control. And it puts long-term tenants in this really awkward position of essentially selling out future tenants' rent control. There's a lot of people, a lot of attorneys who think it's not legal under the rent control laws, but it has, as you can see, it's happened a lot. So we would just be, our platform calls for eliminating these voluntary agreements.
So our demands, we think that everyone deserves to have predictable and stable rent increases. All DC renters deserve to be protected and know when their rent should be increases. So our demands is to ensure that all renters have one rent increase per year. And just to tell you guys a little bit about our campaign, Reclaim Rent Control is designed to improve rent control, preserve affordable housing, and strengthen and expand the current rent control laws. We're endorsed by over 50 organizations such as tenants unions, laborers, legal advocacy groups, religious organizations, and community-based organizations.
So where we're at right now is, as you may know, rent control expires in 2020, which means it needs to be authorized reauthorized by the end of the year. We do have support from everyone on the council has said they support reauthorizing rent control. Our position is that you'd be reauthorizing the status quo. This would just be reauthorizing a broken system. So what we're really saying is this is an opportunity to not just extend the current system, but to strengthen and expand rent control. And so we do have legislation that's an omnibus legislation that includes all of these provisions that we're asking the council to pass. Councilmember Nadeau has committed to introducing that legislation. And we've gotten support from, as well from Councilmember Trayon White, Alyssa Silverman. Robert White is kind of on the fence. There's some things he likes, some things he doesn't like. And Councilmember Bonds, similarly, she said there's something she likes in our suggested reforms, something she doesn't. She has not committed to moving legislation for a hearing or for a vote. So we're really trying, our kind of campaign is focused on her. And even telling, we've said to her, if she doesn't, we get it that she may not support every provision of the platform, but that there should really be a hearing on this. And so what we're asking from ANCs, how you all can get involved is we have a sample resolution and we can put that in the chat. And we've had, I think there's actually somebody on whose ANC has passed it. Oh, she was on. Let's see. I think Damiana. We'd love to come and talk to your ANC. If you'd like, we can have somebody from your ANC, most likely. We have 4,000 individuals who have signed on as supporters to the campaign. So we have people from across the district to speak to your ANC about the platform. And then particularly in the fall, there'll be opportunities to turn out and support, particularly in hearings. And Eliana's putting the link to the sample resolutions. We can also email those out to everybody as well. Was that the end of our? So we have a bunch of questions in the chat. Cool. So you can see that we linked the resolutions and also our petition. Also, you all are, of course, invited and welcome to sign on to the petition. And so that we can count you among those 4,000 plus people who are supporting the campaign. It also means you'll get periodic emails from us about how to stay engaged.